arrogant judge mocked a humble woman, not knowing she could outclass him in court. The courthouse was buzzing with low whispers as people shuffled into their seats. It was a high-profile case, one that had caught the attention of nearly everyone in town. At the center of it all stood a humble woman named Clara. She wore a plain dress, nothing fancy, no jewelry to catch the light, her hair pulled back simply and neatly. Many people thought she looked out of place among the polished lawyers and stern officials. The arrogant judge on the bench certainly thought so. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as he looked down at her. In his eyes, she was nothing but an ordinary woman who had wandered into a world too complex for her. The lawyers on the opposing side chuckled under their breath, whispering to one another about how quickly she would fail. But Clara remained calm, her eyes steady, her hands folded before her. She had been underestimated her whole life, and she knew how to use that to her advantage. The case was complicated with layers of contracts, disputes, and accusations that would intimidate even seasoned attorneys. The judge cleared his throat and spoke with condescension dripping from every word. He asked Clara if she even understood the law she was trying to argue, if she realized how foolish it was to represent herself against trained professionals. The courtroom filled with quiet laughter as eyes turned toward her, expecting her to stumble. Clara simply nodded and replied softly that she understood more than he thought. Then she opened her folder and began to speak. Her voice was steady, not loud, not aggressive, but filled with clarity and precision. She quoted sections of the law without hesitation, pointing out contradictions in the opposing arguments and exposing errors that even the lawyers had missed. At first, the judge waved his hand dismissively, but as she continued, his smirk began to falter. The crowd leaned in, their whispers dying down, replaced with silence as they listened. Clara broke down each contract clause with ease, explaining them in plain language so that even those unfamiliar with legal terms could follow. The jury sat straighter, their pens moving quickly as they took notes. The opposing lawyers shifted uncomfortably, flipping through their papers, realizing they had overlooked crucial details. The judge interrupted her more than once, trying to throw her off balance with sarcastic remarks, but Clara never faltered. Each time he mocked her, she answered with a fact sharper than a blade, and every word tightened the grip she had on the room. By midday, it was no longer Clara who looked out of place, it was the arrogant judge. His confident tone had given way to irritation, his attempts at control slipping through his fingers. And Clara stood calm at the center of it all, humble in appearance, yet commanding the entire court with the strength of her knowledge. The spectators began to exchange glances, their expressions changing from amusement to awe. They had expected a timid woman to crumble under pressure, yet what they saw was someone dismantling an entire case with patience and brilliance. Clara did not raise her voice, she did not grandstand, she simply allowed the truth to reveal itself, one careful word at a time. The opposing lawyers grew restless, one of them stood to object, but his objection fell flat as Clara pointed to the very section of the law that allowed her to continue. The judge shifted in his seat, tapping his gavel with irritation. He asked Clara if she was finished, hoping to end her line of reasoning, but she smiled gently and said she was only getting started. She moved on to the evidence documents the other side had introduced with confidence. One by one, she highlighted inconsistencies, dates that did not match, signatures that looked suspicious, contracts that contradicted themselves. Every piece of paper they had tried to use against her became a weapon in her hands. The jury was no longer scribbling notes, they were staring openly at her, their faces showing both surprise and respect. Even those in the gallery leaned forward, hanging on every word. The judge tried to interrupt again, this time his tone sharper, but Clara calmly waited for him to finish, then replied with a precise legal citation that silenced him completely. For the first time since the trial began, the arrogance in his eyes flickered with doubt. Clara continued speaking methodically, weaving together law and evidence until the picture was undeniable. She was no longer just defending herself, she was teaching everyone in that room how the law truly worked. The court clerk watched in amazement, the stenographer barely keeping up with her steady flow of points and counterpoints. And slowly the laughter that had filled the courtroom in the morning was replaced with respect and even a quiet admiration for the woman who stood alone yet stronger than them all. The air in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing moment. The arrogance that once lingered in the judge's smirk had now faded, completely replaced by a tight jaw and restless hands drumming on the bench. Clara kept her gaze steady, never raising her voice, never rushing her words. Every sentence landed with precision, each fact layered carefully upon the last, until her argument was a wall no one could climb over. The opposing lawyers whispered urgently, flipping through their binders, trying to find a way to dismantle her reasoning. But Clara anticipated their moves. She countered their objections before they even finished speaking. She quoted laws they should have known and brought up cases they should have remembered. Their faces flushed as they realized she was not only prepared, she was steps ahead of them. The jury leaned closer, some nodding to themselves as if her logic had cleared a fog they had been trapped in since the case began. One of the younger lawyers finally stood, desperate to turn the tide. He accused Clara of twisting the law to suit her needs. The room grew tense, waiting to see if she would falter under the accusation. But Clara simply lifted another document, her hand calm and steady. She pointed out the exact wording that validated her claim, then explained it with such clarity that even a child could have understood. The younger lawyer sat down slowly, defeated. The judge adjusted his robe, clearing his throat, his authority slipping further with every exchange. He had mocked Clara that morning, certain she would embarrass herself before the court. But now it was he who felt exposed, unable to silence her brilliance without revealing his own bias. Clara paused at last, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. She looked neither proud nor smug, only steady and humble, as if she had simply spoken the truth and nothing more. And yet everyone in the room could feel it. The tide of the trial had shifted completely, and there was no going back. The silence stretched long after Clara's last words. The jury members exchanged glances, as if confirming with each other that they had all witnessed the same extraordinary shift. Even those in the gallery who had come for spectacle sat straighter, their earlier smirks gone, replaced by quiet awe. The opposing lawyers shuffled papers without purpose, pretending to prepare, while their confidence bled away. Clara stood motionless, her expression calm, her eyes focused on the bench, as if waiting patiently for the judge to find his voice. When he finally spoke, his tone was strained, his attempt at authority cracking at the edges. He reminded the courtroom that it was his duty to maintain order, but even as he said it, his words rang hollow. Clara bowed her head slightly, acknowledging his position, yet not yielding an inch of her ground. Then she asked to continue with her presentation of evidence. The judge hesitated, clearly wanting to deny her, but the weight of the jury's gaze and the expectant silence of the gallery forced his hand. With a reluctant wave, he allowed her to proceed. Clara opened a final folder filled with records and letters that had been overlooked by nearly everyone. Each page revealed another piece of a larger pattern, one that exposed not only the flaws in the opposing side's argument, but also the carelessness that had been ignored under the judge's watch. The courtroom buzzed again, whispers rising like a storm. The arrogance that had once defined the judge was now replaced with unease as he realized the ground beneath him was crumbling. Clara did not smile, she did not gloat, she simply continued, as though she were fulfilling a quiet duty. Every word she spoke carried the same weight as the gavel itself, and it was clear to all who listened that she had taken control of the courtroom without ever needing to raise her voice. The clerk shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at the judge, and then at Clara as if uncertain where the true authority now rested. The stenographer kept her eyes down, her fingers flying across the keys, yet even she could not hide the faint smile tugging at her lips. The gallery leaned forward, their breaths held as Clara unfolded yet another document and laid it neatly before the court. Her voice was soft but unwavering as she explained how this single piece of evidence tied every inconsistency together. The opposing counsel looked trapped, like chess players who suddenly realized they were cornered with no moves left. One lawyer wiped sweat from his brow, another stared down at his notes, refusing to look at the jury. The judge gripped his gavel tighter, his knuckles pale with tension, but he did not strike it. He knew that silencing Clara now would expose his bias more than anything else. Clara paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words fill the room, then she looked at the jury directly, her gaze calm, yet piercing. She told them that the law was not a weapon for the powerful, but a shield for the just. Her words were simple and unadorned, yet they struck deeper than any polished speech could have. The jury sat frozen, the truth ringing clear in their minds. The gallery broke into murmurs, the sound of people realizing they had just witnessed something far greater than a legal defense. Clara stepped back slightly, gathering her papers, her presence still commanding even in silence. The judge stared down at her, his arrogance stripped away, his eyes filled with something he had not expected to feel in his own courtroom: doubt. And in that moment, everyone understood that the humble woman standing before them was no ordinary defendant. She was the force that had turned the trial upside down. The room felt different now. The balance had shifted entirely. Clara stood composed, her papers neatly stacked, her hands resting gently on them, as if the storm she unleashed had been nothing more than routine. The jury whispered softly among themselves, their pens resting, their eyes fixed on her with admiration and respect. Even those in the gallery who had doubted her earlier now looked as though they were witnessing history unfold before them. The opposing lawyers seemed smaller, their shoulders slumped, their voices absent, as though every argument they had prepared had been dismantled before it could take shape. The judge cleared his throat, his attempt at authority wavering. He leaned forward, trying to regain control, but the weight of Clara's presence overshadowed him. He asked her sharply if she had anything more to add, his voice harsher than before but also tinged with uncertainty. Clara met his gaze with calm composure and said yes, she had one more point to make. She reached into her folder and produced a final letter, one that had not been mentioned once during the trial. The silence deepened as she unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning it before she began to read aloud. The words were clear, precise, and devastating, each line unraveling the last defense the opposition had clung to. The jury sat still, hanging onto every syllable. The gallery leaned forward, breaths caught in their throats. The judge shifted again, unease flashing across his face for the first time since he had taken the bench. Clara finished the letter, folded it with deliberate care, and placed it back into the folder. Then she looked up at the court, her expression as humble as when she had first stepped inside, yet now carrying the undeniable weight of victory. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with the realization that a woman once mocked had just outclassed everyone in the room without raising her voice, without losing her grace. The stillness in the courtroom stretched so long that even the ticking of the old clock above the bench sounded louder than usual. The jury shifted in their seats, but their eyes never left Clara, their expressions a mix of respect and disbelief at what they had just heard. The gallery erupted into low murmurs, people leaning toward one another, whispering about how thoroughly she had dismantled the case. Even those who had doubted her at the beginning now looked at her with something close to awe. The opposing lawyers sat frozen, their once confident postures gone, their stacks of documents now nothing but paper with no power. One of them tried to rise, his lips parting as if to argue, but the weight of Clara's evidence and the silence of the room pressed him back down into his chair. The judge gripped the edge of the bench, his eyes darting between Clara, the jury, and the restless crowd. He cleared his throat, but the sound carried no authority anymore. Clara did not speak. She allowed the silence to work in her favor, her calm presence drawing every gaze back to her. Finally, the judge asked in a strained voice if she had concluded her defense. Clara answered softly that her case had been made and that the truth now belonged to the jury to decide. The gallery stirred again, and for the first time since the trial began, the power in the room no longer flowed from the bench, but from the humble woman who stood with quiet certainty. The judge leaned back, clearly unsettled, his arrogance cracked beyond repair, his gaze flickering with something he had never shown before, doubt mixed with fear. Clara gathered her papers slowly, each movement precise, as if reminding everyone that she had not rushed nor faltered at any step. And as she placed the final folder back into her bag, the courtroom felt charged with the weight of what had just unfolded, a sense that nothing here would ever be the same again. The jurors exchanged glances, as if words were no longer needed between them. Their expressions told the story of people who had walked into the room uncertain and were now united in quiet understanding. The gallery leaned forward, hanging on every small movement Clara made, as though she were carrying the outcome in her very hands. The opposing counsel shuffled their papers in desperation, but the sound was hollow, like the last notes of a broken instrument. One lawyer stood briefly and tried to object, but the words fell flat, his voice thin against the steady calm that Clara radiated. The judge tapped his gavel against the bench, but the sound did not command the respect it once had. It was sharp but empty. Clara lifted her head and looked directly at the jury, her eyes clear, her voice calm, as she reminded them that justice was never about titles or power but about truth. The jury members nodded almost instinctively, their pens scratching a few final notes, as though sealing her words into memory. The crowd in the gallery stirred, some shaking their heads at the arrogance that had led to this trial, others smiling faintly, as though relieved to see a spark of fairness return. The judge shifted in his chair, trying to regain control, but his face betrayed the weight pressing down on him. His arrogance that once filled the room was now nothing more than a shadow compared to the light of Clara's composure. And though she stood quietly, her presence spoke louder than any ruling the court had ever witnessed before. The minutes dragged on, but the tension never broke. Clara remained composed, her hands folded over her papers, her gaze steady and unwavering. The jury leaned back slightly, their faces a mixture of contemplation and quiet admiration. The gallery whispered softly among themselves, but every eye kept returning to her as if drawn by an invisible force. The opposing lawyers muttered under their breaths, clearly frustrated at their inability to find a flaw in her arguments. The judge adjusted his robe, his fingers tapping nervously against the wood of the bench. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came, the authority he had relied upon for years slipping further with each passing second. Clara took a slow breath and spoke again softly, reminding the court that the law was not meant to intimidate or mock, but to protect and serve the truth. Her words were simple, yet carried a weight that seemed to press against the walls of the courtroom itself. The jurors nodded subtly, some exchanging quiet looks confirming that her logic was undeniable. Even the gallery sat straighter, sensing the shift in power that had taken place so subtly, yet so completely. The opposing lawyers shuffled their papers helplessly, unable to find a path forward. And the judge sat still, gripping the edge of his bench, his face pale, his mind racing with the realization that he had underestimated her in every possible way. Clara slowly gathered her documents, her movements deliberate and unhurried as she prepared to leave the podium. And though she said nothing further, the courtroom felt the force of her presence, the quiet certainty that she had outclassed everyone in the room without a single gesture of arrogance. Clara stepped back from the podium and adjusted her bag over her shoulder. The room was silent for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Then the judge cleared his throat slowly and called the court to order, but his words lacked conviction. The jury rose from their seats to deliver the verdict, and every face was serious, yet there was a quiet respect in their eyes. When they announced that the case was ruled in Clara's favor, a ripple of astonishment ran through the courtroom. The opposing lawyers lowered their heads, defeated, unable to argue against the brilliance they had witnessed. The gallery erupted into whispers and quiet applause, some people shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling with relief. Clara walked calmly out of the courtroom, her steps steady and confident, leaving behind a room forever changed. The arrogant judge sat frozen in his seat, his smirk gone, replaced by the bitter realization that he had been outclassed. Outside, neighbors and onlookers spoke in hushed tones about the humble woman who had stood her ground and turned the courtroom upside down. And Clara, though modest in appearance, knew that her quiet determination and mastery of the law had not only won the case, but commanded respect that no arrogance could ever take away. From that day on, her name carried a weight in the town, a reminder that true intelligence and courage need no grandeur to triumph.